the Open Minds podcast with Paul Pitsaris. The Open Minds podcast is a podcast that talks to people who really personify having an open mind. And not only that, they're doing their bit in their community, in their human ecosystem to make the world around them a better place. And today's guest exemplifies exactly that. Her name is Lucy Lopez. She's a speaker, mentor, and meditation teacher at Get Enlightened. Lucy's got a Bachelor of Science honours degree from the University of London. She's also got a postgrad in education from the University of Hong Kong. And for the last 5 years or so, Lucy has been researching cognitive psychology with an emphasis and focus on how beliefs impact our well-being, which I thought is absolutely fascinating and is why I had to have her on the podcast. Lucy, welcome to Open Minds.
Thank you so much, Paul. It's a real pleasure to be here.
Thank you for coming on board, Lucy. Lucy, I thought we'd start the podcast by asking you a little bit about your journey since your studies, and in particular, through that, working journey. Were there any experiences that were really prolific in you becoming a meditation teacher?
So, Paul, if you don't mind, I actually would love to share with you something that happened when I was about 10 years old, very much earlier in my life. And I often forget to mention this, but actually it was, I think, the first time that the seed for wanting to go into the journey of and the lifestyle of meditation was actually sowed in me.
Wow.
And so if I can share that with you, I think that would help to kind of see how it is that I've landed here where I am now. So when I was about 10, maybe even 9 years old, one of my older brothers, who was doing a medical degree overseas, came back home on holidays. And one afternoon, he's quite a bit older than me, one afternoon, around about what we call tea time, I just happened to sort of wander into the living room where he was sitting, and I noticed that he was sitting like this, if I can just demonstrate. And I sat on the couch across from him and I looked at him in absolute silence. And I thought, that's just how I want to feel. I had no idea what he was doing,
Yes.
but something in me just knew instantly this is how I would like to feel. And I might say, Paul, just to help, appreciate this event in my life, I came from a very, very troubled background. There was a lot of violence in my home, a lot of violence. And so, I was constantly, if you like, in a state of trauma, you might say. And so for me to be able to find this moment of peace, witness this moment of, to me, just beautiful, absolute peace, I think it was instrumental. And I often forget to mention it, but my word, that was the first instance, I would say, of what took me in a very convoluted way to this point.
Fascinating. How much older was your brother, Lucy?
He's about 7 years older. I said a lot older because when you're a child, 7 years is a lot.
Correct. So you witnessed that moment, and there was something in that calmness, that tranquility that you really wanted to emulate. Yeah.
Totally, my goodness, yes.
Amazing.
I had no idea what it was, but I just knew. That was the peace. That was the thing I was seeking to feel, whatever it was.
Did you know that back then that what he was doing?
No, no idea. No idea. I didn't ask him, wasn't a, I didn't even know how I would ask him about it. Like, it didn't even occur to me to say, "What are you doing?" It didn't even occur to me to say that. But
Yeah.
just seeing it was a beautiful imprint, I would say, on my mind and in my heart.
Yes. Imprints, I think, are very important as we journey through life. What were some of the imprints that you had in your later years, teenage years, early adolescence, and early adulthood?
Mm. So, well, imprints of violence, injustice, grave injustice, um, imprints of doctrine, dogma from within the Catholic tradition,
Right.
imprints of, yeah, guilt, unworthiness,
Yeah. Where did you grow up
lots of. I grew up in Malaysia.
in Malaysia?
Mm.
And what did your journey look like in um, transcending that injustice or transitioning out of it? Was there a catalyst? Or
Um, so, in my household, my mother was if you like, the main victim. Um, and all of us children copped it as well. But my mum, she got the worst of it. And it was relentless. It was daily, and it wasn't a question of when it was going to happen, but sorry, it wasn't a question of if it was going to happen, but when it was going to happen. But that it was going to happen was certain. I'm talking about the violence and the abuse and so on. And so the way looking back, the way I responded to that was to carry a lot of anger, a lot of rage, a lot of resentment, a lot of, um, righteous indignation
Mhm.
on the one hand. And on the other hand, to feel incredible guilt about not, if you like, not agreeing to what was the contracts that were being laid down on us, not agreeing to, and I did it in a very, if you like, passive way. I wasn't, as a female and the youngest within the family, it wasn't, um, it wasn't uh, uh, allowed for us. We didn't have a voice, to be honest. So the voice was held internally as a silent rage.
Yeah.
And occasionally it would flare up. But,
Mm.
Even then, it would flare up only in certain circumstances and certain places.
Mm.
Um, so there was all of that anger, that rage, the indignation, and then on the other hand, the guilt for behaving in ways that were supposedly, not conforming to the rules and codes of behavior that were expected.
Right.
And then, in addition to that, feeling enormously afraid for and protective of my mother. So those were all that was sort of bubbling and raging within me. And that was pretty much what I carried through my teenage years and into my early adulthood. And certainly informed a lot of the decisions that I made.
I bet. And then moving into your education, Bachelor of Science. What really motivated that, Lucy?
That's a. I was always interested in science. I was very fond of chemistry and biology, and I loved maths. And so I assumed that, that would be where I was going to go. But quite frankly, I didn't know what I was going to do with the degree. I knew I didn't want to teach. And I knew that that was a reaction against my father, who had, in one way or another, declared to all his children that the only professions we should be allowed to go into that was deemed noble enough for us to profess were the religious life, teaching, or medicine. So, we were told that that was pretty much it and nothing else. So here I was, very much reacting against my father. I never wanted to teach.
Science, yeah.
And unfortunately, that's exactly where I ended up.
Right. So you teach secondary students?
So I taught high school and I taught at university as well.
Right. Okay. All right. And was that in Malaysia, Lucy, or where was that?
No, I never did in Malaysia. I did it in Hong Kong and I did it here in Brisbane.
Right. Okay. All right. Amazing. And so you're a teacher, and I believe you worked in the corporate world as well, like management.
Yes, I did. Yes, I went into human resource management. And what a marvelous experience that was, because it really showed me what I didn't want to do.
Sometimes that can be a blessing. So
totally.
yeah. So it took a while, would you say, before you found your purpose? But everything that happened along the way was meant to happen.
Certainly was instructive.
Mm.
When I was finally able and willing to pay attention and listen to it, then I was able to stop fighting and really allow that natural calling to express its voice and to start following its guidance.
How did that come about? That ability to pay attention, that ability to be really present. Was that a work in progress, would you say?
So I would say that it was through meditation.
Right.
Very much through meditation. Because when I started, one of the things that was so profound and significant was being able to watch my mind in action. To literally watch my mind in action. To have that distance between myself as observer and all the activity and all the drama that was happening. And to be able to recognize that all that activity and all that drama was not who I was. Because ultimately, who I was, who I am, is that witnessing presence.
Observe.
And so, by seeing this mind in action, noticing what was pushing and pulling it, what was motivating it, what was compelling it into particular kinds of behaviors and so on, made me realize, goodness me, do I want for this mind to continue running the show and calling the shots? And I realized, to what extent has that been helpful? What kind of experiences has that led me to? What kind of emotional states has that generated over the period of my life thus far. It was so obvious to me that so much of my pain and suffering was a result of this mind that didn't know any better, that didn't know any different. It was this mind calling the shots in a very habitual, in a very automatic, in a very rehearsed way.
Yes.
And I realized that doesn't need to continue.
What a beautiful realization. Lucy, when did you first get into meditation? You had that moment as a 10-year-old. What I really appreciate about the day and age we're living in is they're now teaching meditation in school, early primary school. Me personally, I didn't really know about meditation until my teens, later teens perhaps. How did you first get into meditation?
So, quite some years later, after that incident with my brother, I was studying in England, and I'd come back home for a holiday, and I met somebody, one of my brother's friends, and she was a practitioner of transcendental meditation.
Right.
And I was, again, that curiosity within me, that desire within me was so powerfully aroused. And I asked her repeatedly, tell me what you're doing, what's happening. And so she was very scant with the information that she gave me. But at the same time, I could see that certainly from the way she carried herself and from what she did tell me,
Yes.
that it was having a major positive impact on her life. And so that was another encounter. And from the scant information that she gave me, I thought, let me try and put this together myself and see if I can do it. And of course, I tried, but I certainly didn't. It didn't provide a kind of experience that would make me want to commit to an ongoing practice. So that was then. Then years later, in 91, when I first arrived in Brisbane, I think it was maybe in that year or the year later, when somebody invited me to the Buddhist monastery, the Tibetan Buddhist monastery in Yudlo, Langri Tangpa. Sorry, no, that's Langri Tangpa. Anyway, the Buddhist monastery in Yudlo, North Queensland. And I went there, and the person who invited me was the sister of a nun who was a resident in that monastery. And here was my third encounter. It's funny, I'm hearing myself say it in this sequence for the first time.
Wow, okay.
I've never actually told the story in this particular sequence, these three events. But anyway,
How old were you? Sorry, Lucy. How old were you this third time around?
Oh, this was in my 30s.
Okay.
My 30s. So I walked. There were a group of us. She'd gathered. She was a student at QUT at the time, and she'd invited a group of us. And I was, it was a weekend, and we went into this monastery, and there she was. Her sister, the nun, greeted us. And as soon as I laid eyes on this nun, once again, that deep desire to be like that, to feel that way, to embody that kind of tranquility, that kind of peace and presence, that just welled up within me. And so I had a taste, if you like, of some meditation. It was visualization mostly, not so much the the Vipassana kind of meditation, not that, but more visualization. And then I had an amazing experience during one of those meditations. It's quite extraordinary. Now as I remember it, it still brings up that, whoa, that
Yeah.
was amazing. Anyway,
Are you able to share
so,
that experience? I'm fascinated to know.
oh, well, yeah, it was the first time that I felt I was, there was no me.
There was no you.
The first time I
Wow.
ever, there was no me, no self,
No
no
self.
self, the very first time. And then so I was like suspended. There was no I to be suspended. There was nothing. I don't know what you want to call it, free fall. I don't know. But and then soon enough, of course, the conditioned mind or the ego mind, hot on the heels, and said, "No, come back, you belong with me," And I felt terrified at the realization that, my God, I'd lost myself for a while. Totally lost myself. So that was kind of scary.
Mm. And I
But
guess
at the same time,
it's
it was,
liberating, right?
yeah, totally. Yeah.
Fascinating, fascinating. Lucy, I think you've touched on a really important point. You mentioned it with the nun and the lady you met in London, your brother's friend, and that is, I think people who have been meditating for some time, you do notice the way they carry themselves. They have a very calm, composed disposition, and they're able to maintain that even when stress and pressure is upon them. And I note that you've been a meditation teacher now for 20 years, being registered with Meditation Australia. Within that period, how, you've mentioned a very powerful experience just then, but within that 20 years, how has your personal practice developed, evolved? And perhaps you can speak also on some of the benefits you've noticed in your life.
Okay. So, with the personal practice, there is there is a core component that has remained steady and stable throughout these years, and that is the core practice of mind-body awareness.
Mm-hmm.
Just noticing
Yeah.
and noticing and noticing, and to me, that is, as far as I'm concerned, that is foundation. That is the bread and butter of the practice. And everything else, I think, um, well, if you've got that grounding, if you've got that foundation, then everything else is um, both something that you can enjoy more, but also something that is supported by this foundational practice. So, whilst when I first began, that was my only practice, body mind awareness. 2 hours in the morning, 2 hours in the evening.
Wow.
And then throughout the day, maintaining that inner vigilance.
Yeah. So you're able
Or
to
at least trying to maintain
through your day.
that, yes, trying to maintain that inner vigilance. Of course, there's no way that I'm there 24/7. I'll be lucky if I'm there even 7 minutes in total during a day. But what happens is that I can quickly come back.
Yeah.
I notice far more quickly when I'm not in it, and I can bring myself back. And that is especially helpful when I am in situations that are unpleasant, where there's conflict, where there's disappointment, etc., etc. So, how has the practice evolved? Well, with that foundation, I have then been able to use visualization.
Right. Okay.
And that has been incredibly powerful. And so visualization increasingly has become, another core component of what I do. In fact, my daily practice is a combination first of the mind body awareness, and then followed by visualization, in which I place my intentions for the day. And that has now become pretty much my practice.
That's so important. So when you say that when you're visualizing your intentions, are you visualizing yourself in that moment, completing that task, talking to that particular person? Right. Is there an overlap?
Totally. Is there what? Sorry?
Is that an overlap with manifestation?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So the point of visualization is giving you the opportunity to proactively prepare yourself and guide yourself through the day. Independent of whatever else and whoever else may be involved. This is really key for my practice, so that the nature of the visualization, the genesis of it, if you like, is how I would like to feel as I'm going through various tasks, activities, and encounters.
I was hoping you would lead us to that, the importance of that emotion in relation to.
Totally. Totally. Yes.
Like the fear.
Yes. How do I wish to feel? And this is such a powerful thing that we can do, because regardless of the activity, and I know when I work with my students, for example, they find it, it's on the one hand, because we're so cerebral, most of us have been so conditioned into giving primacy to our intellect. It's not always easy, and we're not always willing to come from, as they say, from the head to the heart. We are not willing to do that. And in fact, we're terrified of doing that, because we have been taught that we cannot trust our emotions. That we cannot trust our heart. Don't follow your heart, follow your head. That's the kind of teaching we've had. But here's the thing with visualization, with holding intention and proactively engineering, if you like, your day in accordance with your emotions, there is nothing that you cannot bring into intentioning. So, for example, even if it's the most rotten, awful, despised task that you need to do, you have to do it, and you really resent having to do it, and you don't want to do it, but there's no reason why you can't bring it into your intention and say, when I'm doing this, this is how I'd like to feel.
So you can change the way you feel.
Yes.
By setting
there's no way. You've got this mind so powerful that regardless of your history, whether it's with a task or with a person, there's no reason why I can say, well, when I'm meeting with that person, I know I might have felt all of this and that and the other, but today when I meet with them, this is how I'd like to feel.
Yeah, so important.
Wow.
It's a form of mental preparation, and it's also a form of bringing energy, the energy spawning from the intent, the emotion, energy into form, if you like, and thus the manifestation.
Oh, I totally agree. It is actually, yes, energizing the field.
Yeah.
Allowing the kinds of energy that you want.
Yes. Yep. Spot on. Lucy, I want to ask you. You mentioned previously about meditation facilitating us becoming the witness, the observer behind our thoughts, and being the observer, similar to what we're just talking about, of being the conditioned self, our conditioned response to, say, a challenging situation. And I would love for you to just expand on that, to let the listeners know your viewpoint on the difference between the conditioned self and what you call the transcendent self.
Okay, so the conditioned self is essentially the historical, the biographical, the
Mm-hmm.
cultural, the
Yeah.
religious, the political
Yeah.
self, the personality self.
Right.
And all of this has been learned.
Mm-hmm.
It has been learned through our individual experiences, but it has also been learned through the collective experience that we inherit by virtue of being born into this physical world.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Is that what Jung calls the unconscious collective?
The collective unconscious. Yes.
Mm-hmm.
So we are conditioned by all of that. I would say that the conditioned mind is the filtered mind. It's a filtered and filtering mind. It does not see anything as it truly is. It sees everything as it has learned to see it.
Yes. So we're talking about the realm of the subconscious, Lucy?
We are talking about, now, here's the thing. I'm really talking about the personality, the ego mind,
Right, okay.
which has learned to see everything the way it sees it.
Mm-hmm.
And so that ego mind is informed by our personal experiences as well as our collective human experiences. The subconscious mind is, if you like, that field, that recording device, if you like, that records. And there's the difference. There is the difference.
Mm-hmm.
It is indiscriminate in what it records. It doesn't make decisions one way or the other. It just records whatever information passes through it.
Yes. Would I be
But
correct?
the ego is a filtered mind.
Right, so the ego is the filtered mind. Would I be correct in assuming that the subconscious is more likely to pay attention to events it records that have a heightened emotion attached to it, positive or negative?
It's not as if it pays more attention to it, but if you like, the strength of the imprints, subconscious mind, clearly the strength is increased when, number one, it is repeated, and number two, when it is intense.
Right, okay. Right, okay. And what about, we're speaking, you mentioned ego, and I guess I'd love to bring this into your research around, the impact that beliefs have on things like our well-being. Would you say that there's an overlap between the beliefs that the ego hangs onto, and ultimately, my question is, does that form a big part of the ego, in your opinion, that the beliefs that we have stemming from those experiences and thoughts that you mentioned, and the collective unconscious, is that all interrelated? And if so, how so?
Yes, absolutely. So I tend to keep things very simple. I will either speak in terms of the conditioned mind and the unconditioned mind, or the ego and the true self.
Yes. Right.
I
Okay.
keep things simple. So in both cases, whether it's the unconditioned mind or the ego, I use those interchangeably.
Right. Okay.
Um, as I said, everything is learned. We have learned our beliefs, and we have, you know, predispositions towards certain beliefs,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And we are conditioned by those beliefs. They are the filters. They are the very strong filters through which we create our life experiences and we experience the events in our life
Mm,
and interpret those events.
sure. So when you talk about the transcendent self, the I got the term you used. Was it the higher self or the true self? Where does that self come from?
So, and this is where meditation comes in because um, unlike the conditioned self, which is the self that has learned everything it knows, the unconditioned self has never been taught, can never be taught, has never learned anything.
Interesting. Yeah.
Is not conditioned by anything. That is the self that we could well experience when we let all our thoughts and all the preoccupations of our mind settle.
Yeah.
It's like, in Buddhism, they use this beautiful analogy of a glass of muddy water.
Oh yeah.
And at first, when you've got mud in the water, it's all murky and, you know, um, full of activity. But if you stand the glass on a table, on a stable surface, then what happens? The mud settles at the bottom of the glass. And what's revealed is this clear water, right? And that clear water was always there. It was always there. But it's only revealed when all the activity subsides.
Yes, it's a very good analogy.
Right? So it is not introducing anything new into ourselves from outside of us. It is merely revealing what is already there.
Yeah.
And that true self is always present and can be experienced through meditation.
Yes. And thus that moment that you had when you realized that you were beyond the I, beyond the self. And I love that word, the transcendent self, because I believe it alludes to the fact that you're transcending the conditioning, everything that has been learned, and as you say, I believe that that self is always there. And are there any other ways we can tap into it beyond meditation, do you think?
Well, a lot of us have an experience of that transcendent self in unexpected moments,
Mm-hmm.
in unguarded moments, when we are in the presence of extraordinary beauty or in a really, what we might call a transformational experience, like the birth of a child, for example. Um, in these unguarded moments, if you like, the conditioning just collapses. We're caught. It's disarming. We're just whoa.
Yeah.
But then, as I said, the conditioned mind quickly is hot on the heels and says, "Oh, come back! No, don't trust that." Or, that was just fluke. That was just a random thing. No, don't take that seriously.
Yep. That's really fascinating. I mean, it boils back to creation. Those moments, pure creation, and those emotions of love and elation. How do we reconcile then between the two? And does ego have a lot to do with that? Is it ego pulling us back to the conditioned self, do you think?
Totally. The ego is the conditioned self.
Yeah.
And that's, the ego is the mind of fear.
Mm,
It
yes.
is the mind of fear. Why? Because it perceives itself to be a separate entity.
Yes.
And when you perceive yourself to be a separate entity in a wide, vast world
Mm-hmm.
where you have been trained to look out for danger,
Yeah.
right? That sense of constant threat
Mm,
is always as a residual state of stress within us. We carry it as a residual state of stress in our body.
yes.
The ego then is always, it's so afraid. It's so afraid. And so it needs to protect itself and it's always on high alert,
Yeah.
right?
I agree.
And
It's also wrapped up, is it not, with that survival mechanism? I believe that
totally,
our species
totally.
wouldn't be here if we didn't have an ego. But there's also a necessary function, would you say, that the ego plays? I know when, just going back to Carl Jung, when he talks about ego, he talks about it as being representative of the conscious mind. So, being wrapped up in our thoughts, memories, and emotions that you spoke of, and then he breaks it down, doesn't he, in terms of the patterns of behavior into archetypes, in particular the shadow self. But he also talks about the shadow self and the ego as having components of, both a creative and destructive energy. And I'm just wondering if we could explore if there are any positives to the ego around that cultivation of the creative energy.
Well,
And the reason I ask is because I know there is a tendency, for the most part, there are negative connotations. If someone is egotistical, might be a bit full of themselves, but somewhere there, I think the ego has a part to play, and it's about cultivating that. To focus more on the creative side.
so when I talk to my students about the ego,
Hmm.
I like to get them to see that our common uh, understanding and the meaning that we give to the ego is a very narrow and limited one.
Mhm.
And that is, as you just said, we think in terms of being egotistical, which has got to perhaps to do with arrogance and self-centeredness and so on. But I like to encourage people to think about the ego as the mind that is unaware of its true nature.
Mm.
So now that is
Yeah.
a much more vast and deep sense of the ego. It is the
Correct.
mind, and in Buddhism,
Mm.
the ultimate cause of all suffering is what they call fundamental ignorance.
Yeah.
And fundamental ignorance, what is this? It is ignorance of who and what we truly are.
Correct. I mean, that makes perfect sense to me. It's almost as if the ego is afraid of that transcendent self because it's foreign, unfamiliar. Bring me
Totally.
back to the things I'm attached to. Yes.
Absolutely. Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
Yeah.
So when we start to think of the ego in this way, that it's really a mind that is ignorant of its true nature.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I like to also um, use it in parallel to the idea of original sin within the Christian tradition.
Okay.
Now, I don't know about you, but certainly when I was raised as a Catholic, original sin was considered a fundamental flaw, that we are flawed, and that we then have to spend our lives trying to redeem ourselves. And that was how I understood original sin to be. But I have now come to see that original sin, there's only one sin, and that is, if you like, the original sin. And original sin is really the sin, if you want to call it that, or the state of ignorance of who and what we truly are.
Couldn't agree more. Yeah. So what about when we go back to the predisposition that the ego has to attach onto things, such as, beliefs. And we know that a lot of people have limiting beliefs. How does one cultivate the ego or limiting beliefs, Lucy? When it's sometimes seeped in that ignorance, it can be very difficult for some people.
Yeah. It is steeped in that ignorance. And, here's how I like to look at it.
Hmm.
It doesn't help us to vilify the ego.
I agree.
Okay? It helps us to recognize, to understand, and to be aware of it.
Yes.
And by it, I mean the various states of mind and the attributes within those states of mind, including our beliefs, our proclivities, our preferences, our likes and dislikes, and so on and so forth. All of that is under the purview, if you like, of the ego. So if we understand, if we start to look at it like that, then rather than vilify the ego, we say, hang on, mate, I'm going to take charge of you. And when I take charge of you, you're going to become an amazing servant.
Servant to whom?
Right?
To the transcendent self, or
to the natural self, to the true self.
Yeah.
So the ego, as the mind, body, personality, now is in service to the transcendent self.
I love that.
Yeah.
That can
And
be,
so, sorry, please go on, Paul.
I was just going to say it can be a work. Just speaking from my own life experience, it's a work in progress. For me personally, it's taken many years of consistent meditation to reach that realization. But anyway, sorry, I cut you off. You were going to say.
Oh, I was just going to go back to the question you asked me about limiting beliefs and how do we handle these? Well, the first is, of course, to recognize what those beliefs are.
Right.
Now, how do we recognize what our beliefs are, limiting or empowering? How do we recognize them? We recognize them by watching ourselves, watching our thoughts, watching what we say and how we say it, and watching our behavior.
Correct. And I would suggest also that mind-body connection, if those thoughts we're having are manifesting in a physical response, exacerbated heartbeat, perspiration, whatever that might be, then that's also an indicator.
Absolutely. They're all, the body provides us with feedback.
Correct,
it's constantly providing us with feedback. So, you can't go, it's not easy to go directly to our beliefs. It's because the beliefs are very good, just the way they reside. They're kind of all over the place, and they're sometimes they are visible and often they're not. And here's the thing: um, we contradict ourselves really when we start to look at our beliefs, because we have what we call espoused beliefs, the ones that we declare, this is what I believe. But then we have tacit beliefs, which are not necessarily the same as our espoused beliefs, right? So we've got espoused and tacit beliefs. The tacit ones are the hidden ones. And they are the true ones, the things that we truly believe. But we are so good. We've been so conditioned, and we've learned how to speak so well and say the right thing and do the right thing. And also, we genuinely want to be doing the right thing and thinking the right thing and believing the right thing. But we don't necessarily actually believe the things that we declare we believe.
Right. Just elaborate on that last point a little bit, because I think this is
So,
interesting.
for example, you may say that I believe in saving the environment, right?
Yeah.
But there may be conflicting beliefs within you that really don't honor that. So you want to save the environment. You want to be environmentally conscious. But look at your behaviors. What are your behaviors actually reflecting?
Right. Okay.
Are they reflecting that belief?
Does this go to unconscious bias?
Well, unconscious bias is definitely an example of our tacit beliefs. Yes,
Yeah.
totally.
Fascinating. And then it brings up ideas of values as well.
Yes,
We have
indeed.
certain values, and you're right. Sometimes there's an underlying contradiction, and what's the term I'm thinking of? Cognitive dissonance, right? Is when your beliefs are challenged, and you're compelled to when you have that realization to face the beliefs, and when people experience a lot of mental turmoil when their beliefs are
Exactly
brought
right.
into question.
Exactly right.
Mm,
Exactly right. And it is the cause of a great deal of turmoil, a lot of which is very unconsciously or mindlessly expressed
yeah.
in our words and in our behaviors.
So, how then, Lucy, do people who perhaps have identified their limiting beliefs that aren't serving them, how do we go about changing those beliefs?
Um, so it, de- it there are a number of things that we need to be able to do. And the first of them, or the need to be able to be, and the first of them is to be willing,
Mm, yeah.
right? To be willing to change our beliefs. So, um, you know, there, I know for myself, there are things that I might believe that I'm not necessarily willing to change. But it's only until I am willing to change those beliefs
Yeah.
that I can actually change them.
Mm,
Or the other possibility is when I am confronted with an experience that is so overwhelmingly in contradiction to what I believe
yes.
thus far, that I may then almost, without any more further resistance, make that shift.
Yeah. You're compelled to
But
re-examine.
yeah,
It's such an important topic in this day and age. And, we think of all the turmoil that the pandemic has brought, and, people are having very fixed beliefs, even the political storm in the US that has unfolded. But I think it's an important point that you just raised, is that it's only when we are presented with information that really, not, I guess in a way, it contradicts, or the evidence is smacking us in the face that perhaps our beliefs here need to be re-examined. And that's when this cognitive dissonance comes into the equation. Easier said than done, but I think that's some good advice around there.
Just say, though, Paul, just with respect to that,
Mm,
it is not about, in my experience,
yes.
it's not about contradicting evidence,
Okay.
but more about evidence that actually affects us emotionally.
Mm, yes.
If that emotional shift hasn't happened, then you
Mm,
can give me all the evidence in the world.
mm,
It's not going to make the slightest difference to me.
mm,
There needs to be an emotional shift.
yeah. Yeah. And sometimes that emotion comes about. My point was going to be um, through evidence being presented. If we see, a child, for instance,
Mm.
suffering, um, and it can. But again, you're spot on. It comes back to that emotional shift that is necessary. Yeah.
Yeah, when we see the child suffering,
Mm,
uh, and this is why, you know, people, we hear a lot of stuff, we read a lot of stuff, but until we've actually had an experience ourselves, a personal
yeah.
experience,
Yeah. Yeah.
only then is there, if you like, a shift, a transformation.
Exactly. Exactly.
Mm.
Lucy, it's been really fascinating talking to you. I mean, we've unraveled meditation and ego and beliefs, and I could honestly talk to you for hours. But is there any question that I didn't ask, or perhaps any topic that you would like to speak on?
Well, actually, because you've asked about how we change conflicting beliefs,
Mm,
I was just wondering, I mean, in your own practice,
yeah.
Paul, I was wondering how you um,
Mm,
help your clients in shifting beliefs.
yeah, sure. So, the Open Mind Institute, we do a lot of mindset and performance coaching, and the first and foundational step to that is something you're very well versed in, and that is raising levels of self awareness. And we
Mm.
do that through meditation, mindfulness practice, so that it's becoming consistent. And we know that the evidence suggests that upon that consistency, we're strengthening the prefrontal cortex, the area of the brain responsible for things like the regulation of our social behavior, decision making, focus, concentration. But it's really from that platform, when that self awareness is raised, that we can actually spot the stimulus response gap, which neuroscientists tells us now it's only about 5 seconds on average. But it's within that gap, Lucy, that we become aware of our limiting beliefs. We become aware of the beliefs, that the view that we might have on a particular issue, and it's also within that gap that you can recognize the conditioned self in terms of what route they're going to take, or the route that your conditioned self will take upon being presented by a challenge, for instance. And then what we do is we harness things like evidence-based tools, cognitive behavioral therapy, journaling, for instance, so that you can start tracking the inner narrative, start becoming really familiar with your inner narrative, which is representative of your beliefs on any particular issue. Yeah. And then it's from that platform that we can move towards the transcendent self. So by asking some very basic questions like, what's another way I can look at this? How can I change the inner narrative and shift it from, and sometimes it's as simple as tweaking a simple word. Instead of telling ourselves, I don't want to do this, I can't do this, it contradicts my beliefs, and tweaking a simple word from can't to how. How can I do this? How can I look at this differently? And then slowly but surely, we're able to do that in real time, and really holds up a mirror to your beliefs. And if they're not serving you, how can we go about changing that so it's more objective, all encompassing, and in being in consideration of others. So that's how we do it in a nutshell.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Wonderful.
Yeah. And what about yourself? Because I know you do a lot of mentorship
Yeah.
in addition to the meditation. Is this something that comes up frequently with your
So
clients?
it depends on what exactly.
Mm.
Yes, definitely. Beliefs.
Yeah.
Everything ultimately comes down to beliefs,
Mm.
and to what extent we are um, aware or unaware of our beliefs. And then once we can see whether they are serving us or not serving us, then we have, a good basis for change. Um, and like you, changing the dialogue, both internal and external,
Mm.
really important. So I keep a glossary of some the words that I think I know for myself are unhelpful.
Yes.
So one of them, for example, is the word hard or difficult. This is hard, this is difficult.
Mhm.
And for me, I'll say, really, how is it hard? And instead of that, I might say, this is something that I haven't yet worked out how to do.
I love that word yet, right? Yeah. Yeah.
So
Very,
that's one example.
yeah.
Another thing is challenge.
Mm.
And I know some people will argue for, oh yes, I must have that word. It's such a great word. It motivates me to climb up that mountaintop. Okay. But what I hear, and certainly what I've experienced myself, is that puts a lot of stress on me.
Yeah.
And um, and the reason why it puts a lot of stress on me is because it's still very much governed by the ego. The
Mm.
ego is setting out to prove something or
Yeah.
so instead of challenge, I prefer to say invitation.
Ooh, I like that.
In other words, I'm going right to my, as we've said, the transcendent self, the true self that is replete with every goodness and every quality that we could possibly want to feel and express. And so the invitation, to my transcendent self to bring out, to draw out those qualities that are going to, wow, make me rock this boat, make me rock the show.
Yeah.
Not rock the boat so much, but rock the show.
And it just shows the difference that a word can make and the power of the inner narrative.
Yeah.
For the benefits of our listeners, two more of my favorites that I use in the coaching is, if we're telling ourselves we're scared or I'm fearful of this moment, change that word of scared to excited. Right? Similar sort of energy in terms of the hormonal spike in cortisol that we're feeling, right? But just that simple shift. And another one is failure, this attachment that we have to everything that personifies failure, which just can be soul crushing. But instead of telling yourself, I failed at this, you can tell yourself, well, I'm still learning,
Yeah,
We're
totally.
learning. Yeah.
Or as Edison was reported to have said, it's just another way I've learned how not to do it.
Yeah, that's right. Spot on, Lucy. Well, Lucy, we have learned tremendously over the last hour or so with you. I think your knowledge and wisdom, um, you know, has the potential to serve the masses. And I just wanted to ask you, how do people get in touch with you if they want to learn more from you? What's the best way?
Yes, the best way is to go to my website, which is getenlightenedtoday.com.
Right, getenlightenedtoday.com. Well, thank you very much, Lucy, for coming on Open Minds. It's been a tremendous conversation and an honour having you on board. And who knows? There might be potential for a future episode.
Well, Paul, thank you so much for having me. Thank you for being such a gracious interviewer, asking me such great questions. Really appreciate that.
My absolute pleasure. Thank you, Lucy, and take care.
Thank you, Paul.
Cheers.
See you next time. Ciao.